In 281 CE, grave robbers broke into a sealed royal tomb in Hunan Province, China. To light their way, they burned the content of the tomb, using bamboo scrolls they found inside as torches. These scrolls turned out to be among the most controversial and historically significant documents in Chinese civilization. The surviving fragments that did not burn were taken to the imperial court. Scholars began reading them by lamplight, and almost immediately intense debates began. The reason was that what was written on these bamboo strips directly, repeatedly, and measurably contradicted the official version of Chinese history that the Han Dynasty had maintained and taught for roughly 400 years. The discovery itself is recorded in the official historical text Jin Shu, compiled in 648 CE during the Tang Dynasty. According to this record, the tomb belonged to King Xiang of Wei, who died in 296 BCE. The scrolls were transferred to the Imperial Library of the Jin Dynasty, where scholar Sun Tzu led a team responsible for deciphering them. The writing system was extremely archaic and required specialist knowledge even to interpret. A transcription was eventually produced. However, the original bamboo slips themselves disappeared from the Imperial Library sometime before the fall of the Jin Dynasty in 420 CE. This means that what survives today is not the original document, but a copy of a copy, making independent verification of the original text impossible. Modern scholar Edward Shaughnessy of the University of Chicago conducted one of the most rigorous analyses of the Bamboo Annals in his 1997 work, Before Confucius. He identified at least 12 specific factual contradictions between the Bamboo Annals and the Shurji, Records of the Grand Historian, written by Sima Qian around 94 BCE. The Shurji was not merely a personal historical record. It became the official foundation of historical memory in China and served as a legitimizing framework for dynastic rule for centuries. The contradictions are not limited to minor chronological differences. They extend into moral and structural interpretation of early Chinese civilization. One of the most significant disputes concerns the conquest of the Shang dynasty by King Wu of Zhou. The Bamboo Annals date this event using embedded astronomical references, including a recorded comet and a solar eclipse, placing the conquest around 1046 BCE. The Shurji, however, places the same event approximately 20 to 23 years earlier. Modern astronomical reconstructions tend to support the Bamboo Annals dating, suggesting that Sima Qian's official chronology may be incorrect. Even more controversial is the depiction of Emperor Shun. In Confucian tradition, Shun is portrayed as an ideal ruler who peacefully received power from Emperor Yao, representing moral legitimacy and orderly succession. In contrast, the Bamboo Annals describe Shun not as a benevolent successor, but as someone who seized power by force and even imprisoned Yao. Later Confucian scholars rejected such passages, arguing that they must be later additions because they conflicted with established ideology rather than because of textual or archaeological evidence. Early translators such as James Legge noted that the text presents revered founding figures of Chinese civilization in a much less idealized way, portraying them more as political actors and moral archetypes. This shift in portrayal fundamentally changes how early Chinese history can be interpreted. Mainstream scholarship generally explains these differences as a result of multiple historical traditions, regional records, and varying court perspectives. According to this view, the Shurji was based on oral traditions and earlier written materials that were themselves selective. The Bamboo Annals represent an independent strand of historical tradition preserved in a separate lineage. However, critics argue that the Shurji was not just one version among many. It was a defining version. It established a moral and historical framework through which Chinese civilization understood its past. From this perspective, any contradiction is not merely a technical discrepancy, but a challenge to the ideological foundation of historical legitimacy itself. Because the original bamboo slips are lost, debates about authenticity remain unresolved, especially in sections that conflict with established political narratives. Some scholars suggest that inconvenient passages are more likely to be labeled as later interpolations. Others point out that thousands of yet unexcavated tombs from the Warring States period still exist. These may contain additional independent historical records capable of reshaping early Chinese chronology again. The decision of which sites are excavated and when is therefore not purely academic. It is also political. In 180 CE, The early Christian bishop Irenaeus of Lyons wrote a fierce letter warning against a circulating text he referred to as the Gospel of Judas. He considered it dangerous and misleading. He briefly described it and condemned it, but did not preserve the work itself. After that point, the text effectively disappeared for nearly 1,800 years. It reappeared only in the modern era in the form of the Codex Chacos, a damaged manuscript discovered in Egypt, likely in the 1970s. After its discovery, the Codex entered the antiquities black market and passed through private hands for years. During this period, it was stored under poor conditions, including being kept in a safe in Hicksville, New York. The deterioration was severe, and an estimated 15% of the text was permanently lost. In 2000, Swiss antiquities dealer Frieda Nussberger Chacos acquired the manuscript and transferred it to the Maecenas Foundation for restoration. A translation team led by Coptic scholar Rodolphe Kayser, working with support from National Geographic, reconstructed and published the text in 2006. Today, the Codex Chacos is preserved in the Coptic Museum in Cairo. Radiocarbon dating of the manuscript's material places it between 220 and 340 CE. This means the surviving physical copy is later than the original tradition condemned by Irenaeus, suggesting the ideas existed before the extant manuscript itself. The Gospel of Judas presents a radically different theological worldview compared to canonical Christian texts. In this version, Jesus speaks privately to Judas Iscariot and portrays him not as a traitor, but as someone fulfilling a necessary cosmic role. Judas is depicted as acting under instruction rather than betrayal. The cosmology described in the text is highly complex. It includes multiple divine realms, a hierarchy of luminous beings, and a structure of the universe governed by different spiritual entities. In this system, the highest divine principle is distinct from the creator of the material world, who is portrayed as a lesser, flawed being. Translation of the text is highly debated. Some interpretations suggest that Judas is presented as a privileged figure chosen for enlightenment, while others argue that alternative readings of key Coptic terms portray him more negatively, even as a destructive or demonic figure. These differences depend heavily on linguistic nuance and interpretive choices made by scholars. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library in 1945 significantly expanded understanding of early Christian diversity. This collection of 52 texts revealed that early Christianity was not uniform, but included many competing theological traditions, cosmologies, and scriptures. Many of these texts were later excluded or destroyed as Christian doctrine became standardized through institutional processes and church councils. The mainstream academic interpretation is that this process represented theological consolidation rather than suppression of historical truth. Different communities held incompatible beliefs, and standardization was necessary to form a unified doctrine. However, the timeline introduces complexity. Irenaeus condemned texts like the Gospel of Judas in 180 CE, while major doctrinal standardization events, such as the Council of Nicaea, did not occur until 325 CE, over a century later. This raises a question of whether condemnation preceded formal doctrine, or whether doctrine itself was shaped in opposition to already existing alternative texts. Some researchers argue that the cosmological system described in the Gospel of Judas reflects an alternative knowledge tradition that was deliberately excluded because it reduced reliance on institutional interpretation. Others view it simply as one of many competing mythological frameworks that emerged in early Christian thought. The loss of approximately 15% of the Codex Chacos during its storage period highlights another issue: the fragility of recovered knowledge. Portions of the text are permanently missing, leaving gaps in interpretation that cannot be recovered. From this perspective, the Gospel of Judas survives not as a complete document, but as a fragment of a broader intellectual landscape that is only partially accessible today. In the 19th century, a Croatian diplomat named Mihajlo Beric purchased a mummy while traveling in Egypt. He brought it back as a curiosity, and for decades the mummy remained in his home, wrapped and largely forgotten, appearing only as a decorative artifact in a corner of the room. After his death, the mummy was donated to a museum in Zagreb. It was only when a curator began carefully unwrapping the linen bandages that an unexpected discovery was made. The fabric itself was covered in writing. This text became known as the Liber Linteus, or Linen Book. It is the longest known surviving text written in the Etruscan language, a language that remains only partially understood today. What makes the discovery unusual is that the linen was not originally intended as burial wrapping. It had first been used as a written manuscript, and only later was it repurposed as funerary material in Egypt. This reuse is what ultimately preserved it from modern discovery. The text was identified as Etruscan in 1891 by Jacob Krall in Vienna. This identification was significant, but also deeply frustrating for scholars, because Etruscan remains one of the most difficult ancient languages to interpret. The Liber Lentius is held in the Zagreb Archaeological Museum. When fully unfolded, it measures approximately 3.4 meters in length and contains roughly 1,200 words arranged across 12 columns, each containing 13 lines. In terms of word count, it is larger than all other surviving Etruscan inscriptions combined. The Etruscan civilization flourished in central Italy from around 800 BCE to 100 BCE, before being absorbed into the expanding Roman Republic. Roman historian Livy records that Etruscan priests, known as haruspices, preserved a body of sacred texts called Etrusca Disciplina. These texts included instructions on divination, interpreting natural signs, and understanding cosmic cycles. Roman authorities translated and used this knowledge in official religious and political practices. However, the original Etruscan source text did not survive. Today, only around 13,000 Etruscan inscriptions exist, and most are extremely short, names, dedications, or brief labels on objects. The Liber Lentius is therefore exceptional in both length and content. Despite its size, much of the text remains undeciphered. Some words appear repeatedly, such as Sakni, which may refer to ritual or sacred concepts, possibly meaning this or earth, but the limited vocabulary prevents confident translation. As a result, scholars can only tentatively suggest that the text is ritual or calendrical in nature, but its full meaning remains inaccessible. The Epure Papyrus. The Epure Papyrus is an ancient Egyptian manuscript that describes a period of catastrophic social collapse. The surviving text begins mid-sentence, as the beginning and end of the document are missing. What remains describes a world in chaos, rivers behaving unnaturally, crops failing, social order breaking down, and the reversal of established hierarchies. It portrays a society where the wealthy are ruined, institutions collapse, and violence spreads widely. Some passages appear to resemble descriptions found in the biblical book of Exodus, including references to darkness, widespread death, and environmental disaster. The document was acquired by the Leiden Museum in the Netherlands in 1828, purchased from antiquities dealer Giovanni Anastasi. The first full translation was completed in 1909 by Egyptologist Alan Gardner, who titled it The Admonitions of an Egyptian Sage. The papyrus is incomplete and measures approximately 370 centimeters in its surviving form. The author is identified only as Epure, likely a high-ranking official addressing the pharaoh. Linguistically, it is dated to Middle Egyptian and is usually placed between the 13th and 17th dynasties, roughly 1800 to 1600 BC, though some scholars argue it may describe events from an earlier period. Gardner identified at least 18 passages that resemble elements of the Exodus narrative. These include descriptions of a river turning to blood, widespread darkness, crop failure, livestock death, and societal collapse. The similarities are striking enough that they were documented in academic commentary. In 1952, Emanuel Velikovsky proposed that the Epure Papyrus and the Exodus account might describe the same historical catastrophe, suggesting a revised Egyptian chronology. This hypothesis was widely rejected by mainstream Egyptology due to methodological issues, though the textual parallels themselves were not dismissed. Geologist Amesner later suggested that seismic activity combined with environmental disruption of the Nile could produce phenomena such as red water caused by algae blooms, potentially explaining some of the described events in natural terms. Egyptologist John Van Seters argued that parts of the text reflect genuine administrative collapse rather than purely literary metaphor. The dominant academic view is that the papyrus belongs to the Egyptian lament literature genre, in which chaotic imagery is used metaphorically to describe social disorder. According to this interpretation, the text is rhetorical rather than historical. However, critics note that the papyrus alternates between metaphorical imagery and highly concrete administrative descriptions, including references to supply shortages economic breakdown, and institutional failure. This mixture makes classification difficult. Some researchers suggest that both the Apura Papyrus and the Exodus narrative may reflect shared memories of real regional catastrophes, possibly linked to large-scale natural events such as volcanic eruptions. One candidate is a Thera eruption dated to around 1628 BC, which should have caused atmospheric disruption, agricultural collapse, and environmental changes across the eastern Mediterranean. A major unresolved issue is the fragmentary nature of the text. Since both the beginning and end are missing, it is impossible to know the full context, intended conclusion, or scope of the original account. As a result, the Apura Papyrus survives as a partial witness to a catastrophe that may or may not be fully understood. The Voynich Manuscript is a medieval book that has remained undeciphered for over 600 years. It is written in an unknown script and illustrated with strange drawings of plants, astronomical diagrams, and biological systems that do not correspond clearly to any known species or scientific tradition. The manuscript was acquired in 1912 by Wilfrid Voynich, a Polish book dealer, from the Jesuit college at Villa Mondragone near Frascati, Italy. Among the items found with it was a letter dated 1666, written by Johannes Marcus Marci of Prague, which claimed that the book had once belonged to Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, who reportedly paid a large sum for it. Voynich believed the manuscript might have been written by Roger Bacon, a 13th century English philosopher, although this attribution has never been proven. In 1969, the manuscript was donated to Yale University by collector Hans P. Krauss, where it is now held in the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library under Catalog MS-408. Radiocarbon dating performed in 2009 by the University of Arizona placed a parchment between 1404 and 1438 CE with high confidence. This rules out later Renaissance forgery using artificially aged materials and confirms its early 15th century origin. The manuscript contains roughly 240 pages, though some are missing and the original total is unknown. It is written using a system of 20 to 30 distinct glyphs, forming approximately 35,000 word-like units composed of around 170,000 individual characters. Statistical analysis by Jorge Stolfi and others has shown that the text behaves like a natural language in terms of entropy and character distribution. Certain patterns repeat consistently, suggesting internal structure rather than random generation. Despite this, no translation has ever been successful. The NSA has examined the manuscript. Allied codebreakers studied it during World War II, and modern AI systems have also failed to decode it. The illustrations include around 113 plant drawings, none of which have been conclusively matched to known species. Some researchers have suggested possible identification with New World plants, such as sunflower-like structures, which would imply pre-Columbian transatlantic knowledge transfer, but this remains unproven. Other sections depict circular astronomical diagrams with symbols that do not correspond to any known zodiac system, and biological imagery, showing figures in pools connected by pipe-like structures, with no clear medical or anatomical equivalent in medieval science. The dominant academic position is that the manuscript is a sophisticated hoax, possibly generated using a structured method to produce statistically plausible but meaningless text. One proposed method involves grid-based or template systems capable of generating language-like output. However, critics argue that such models fail to explain the manuscript's long-range structural consistency. If it were a hoax, it would represent a uniquely complex and isolated case, unlike any other known forged manuscript tradition. This leaves open alternative interpretations, that it encodes deliberately hidden knowledge, possibly scientific or medical in nature, or that it preserves an unknown linguistic system that has not survived elsewhere. The Dresden Codex. The Dresden Codex is one of the few surviving pre-Columbian Maya books. It survived Spanish colonial destruction largely by chance, despite widespread burning of indigenous texts. In 1562, Bishop Diego de Landa ordered the destruction of Maya manuscripts in Mani, Yucatan. He later wrote that the Maya used complex symbols in their books about history and science, but he ordered them burned regardless. An estimated thousands of codices were destroyed, leaving only a handful surviving today. The Dresden Codex eventually made its way to Europe through unclear routes. It was purchased in Vienna in 1739 by Johann Christian Gatze and later brought to Dresden. It survived the Allied bombing of Dresden in 1945, although it was damaged by water during fire suppression efforts. The Codex consists of 78 pages written on bark paper coated with lime plaster, measuring approximately 3.56 meters when fully unfolded. It contains astronomical tables, calendrical systems, and ritual cycles written in red and black ink. One of its most remarkable sections is the Venus tables, which track the synodic cycle of Venus. The Maya calculated this cycle as approximately 583.92 days, while modern astronomy measures it as 583.924 days. This produces an error of less than a few thousandths of a day per cycle. Over a 384-year Venus cycle, this accuracy results in a cumulative error of less than 2 minutes. Such precision is comparable to modern astronomical calculations and was achieved without telescopic instruments. The Codex also contains eclipse prediction tables based on a 177 to 178 day cycle, allowing prediction of solar and lunar eclipses with high accuracy. Pages 73 to 74 include what is interpreted as a flood almanac, depicting water pouring from celestial serpents, associated with destruction and death. Some researchers link this imagery to regional geological evidence of climatic disruptions. Other sections suggest a correction system for tracking the precession of the equinoxes over long time periods, though this interpretation remains debated. Mainstream explanations argue that these results were achieved through long-term naked-eye observation accumulated over generations of Maya astronomer priests, combined with advanced calendrical notation systems. Over centuries, this would allow highly accurate pattern recognition without requiring modern orbital theory. The destruction of Maya codices is viewed in mainstream scholarship as part of colonial religious suppression, not targeted removal of unique scientific knowledge. However, critics note that observational astronomy alone may not fully explain the integrated structure of multiple systems found in the Dresden Codex, including its Venus cycles, eclipse tables, and flood almanac, which together form a highly coordinated predictive framework. Some researchers propose that the Codex preserves an older astronomical tradition, possibly inherited from earlier civilizations and refined over centuries, rather than being purely a product of independent Maya development. The Codex's long count calendar begins at a fixed starting point corresponding to approximately 3114 BCE, suggesting that Maya cosmology was anchored to a specific astronomical or historical event whose meaning is still not fully understood. The Emerald Tablet is one of the most mysterious short texts in the history of Western thought. It consists of only a few lines, yet it has influenced centuries of philosophy, alchemy, and early science. It is traditionally attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, a legendary figure combining traits of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. This fusion suggests origins in the intellectual environment of Hellenistic Egypt, particularly Alexandria, where Greek and Egyptian traditions merged. The earliest known references to the Emerald Tablet appear in Arabic sources from around the 8th to 10th century CE. The text is preserved in multiple Arabic and Latin versions, none of which match exactly, suggesting it was transmitted through several independent manuscript traditions rather than a single fixed original. The most famous line reads, "That which is below corresponds to that which is above, and that which is above corresponds to that which is below, to accomplish the miracle of the one thing." Isaac Newton studied this text extensively. His handwritten translations and annotations show that he treated it not as mystical poetry, but as a description of natural principles. He believed it might encode a fundamental structure of reality. In modern terms, this idea resembles concepts like scale invariance, where patterns repeat across different levels of magnitude, or the relationship between micro and macro physical laws. However, there is no evidence that the original authors intended such scientific meaning in the modern sense. Most historians interpret the Emerald Tablet as part of late antique Hermetic literature, which blended philosophy, mysticism, and early natural speculation. In this view, its scientific interpretations are later reinterpretations rather than original intent. Still, the fact that Newton, arguably the most influential scientist of the 17th century, considered it seriously for decades has kept it an intellectual discussion far beyond typical mystical texts. The Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is an ancient Jewish text attributed to Enoch, a figure from early biblical tradition. It is not part of the canonical Bible in most religious traditions, but it survives in full in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition and in fragmentary form among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The modern discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 at Qumran revealed multiple copies of the Book of Enoch, showing that it was widely read in certain Jewish communities during the Second Temple period. The text is composed of several sections, but one of the most significant is the Book of Luminaries, chapters 72 to 82, which describes a movement of celestial bodies, including the sun and moon, using a structured calendar system. It presents a 364-day calendar divided into 4 equal seasons of 91 days each. This system is mathematically consistent and differs from the lunar-based calendars used in many neighboring cultures. The text also describes detailed movement of the sun through gates or portals in the sky and provides structured explanations for seasonal changes in daylight. Some interpretations suggest that it encodes systematic astronomical observation. Another major section describes the Watchers, beings who descend to Earth and transmit knowledge to humanity, including metallurgy, astronomy, and medicine. This is often interpreted as mythological, but some researchers view it as symbolic encoding of knowledge transmission. The Book of Enoch also includes descriptions that some scholars associate with axial precession, the slow wobble of Earth's rotational axis over a 26,000 year cycle. While this is debated, it suggests an unusually sophisticated awareness of long-term astronomical patterns if taken literally. Mainstream scholarship generally interprets the Book of Enoch as apocalyptic literature from between the 3rd and 1st centuries BCE, influenced by Babylonian astronomical traditions. Its cosmology is seen as symbolic rather than scientific. However, an important question arises from its preservation history. Multiple copies were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, meaning it was not a marginal or forgotten text within its community, but a widely preserved and respected work. At the same time, later religious authorities excluded it from the canonical Bible, while it remained part of Ethiopian scripture. This divergence shows that canon formation was not uniform across early religious communities. Some researchers argue that its astronomical sections may preserve structured observational knowledge, encoded in symbolic form. Others see it as an example of how ancient cultures express cosmological ideas through narrative rather than mathematical notation. What remains clear is that the Book of Enoch occupies an unusual position, partially preserved, partially excluded, and yet central to debates about early religious cosmology and the history of astronomy. Across all the texts discussed, a recurring pattern emerges. Fragments of knowledge preserved in unusual ways, surviving through accident, concealment, destruction, or selective transmission. Each document exists at the edge of what history can confidently explain. The Bamboo Annals survive only in copies of copies, with the original bamboo strips lost. The Gospel of Judas exists through a manuscript that nearly disintegrated in storage and was condemned before its modern rediscovery. The Liber Lentia survives because a mummy wrapping was repurposed into burial cloth, preserving an Etruscan text that would otherwise have vanished completely. The Epir Papyrus remains incomplete, missing both beginning and end, forcing interpretation from a fragment of a larger narrative. The Colburn Bible survives through contested custodial claims, its authenticity debated, and its provenance unverifiable. The Voynich Manuscript remains unreadable despite centuries of effort from linguists, cryptographers, and modern machine learning systems. The Dresden Codex survived systematic destruction of Maya texts and now stands as one of the only detailed astronomical records from a civilization whose written corpus was almost entirely erased. The Emerald Tablet survives not as an object, but as a repeated textual tradition across centuries of translation and reinterpretation. The Book of Enoch survives in parallel traditions, excluded from some canons while preserved in others. What connects these cases is not a single origin or unified explanation, but a shared condition: knowledge filtered through disruption. Fires, conquests, institutional reforms, religious standardization, decay of materials, and historical accident all shaped what remained. In mainstream historical interpretation, this is expected. Ancient transmission was fragile. Libraries burned. Manuscripts decayed. Political and religious institutions standardized texts for doctrinal or administrative stability. What survives is not what was most true, but what was most successfully transmitted. In alternative interpretations, however, a different pattern is sometimes proposed: that certain categories of knowledge, astronomical precision, cosmological structure, historical accounts conflicting with official narratives, appear repeatedly in texts that were later marginalized, destroyed, or difficult to interpret. This raises questions about whether suppression was purely accidental, structural, or selective. But even within rigorous scholarship, a more grounded version of the same insight is widely accepted. History is not a complete record. It is an archive shaped by survival bias. Every surviving manuscript is a result of countless others that did not survive. The absence of evidence is not neutral. It is produced by physical vulnerability, human decision-making, and historical contingency. A burned library is not just a loss of books. It is a permanent narrowing of what future generations can know. This is why undeciphered or fragmentary texts matter. The Voynich Manuscript may never be read. The missing sections of the Epir Papyrus may never be recovered. The original bamboo strips of the Bamboo Annals may never return. But their existence signals that the historical record is incomplete in ways that cannot be easily measured. The final question raised by these texts is not whether they contain hidden unified secrets, but something simpler and more difficult. How much of the past is missing entirely? Not because it was never known, but because it was never preserved in a way that could survive the journey to the present. And if knowledge can disappear so completely, then every surviving fragment carries a second meaning. It is not only what remains, it is also what escaped destruction. That is a condition of history as we have it. Partial, fractured, and always shaped more by survival than by intention.